Hi, Kevin, and hi, Tocal. I'm Claire, and
I'm Martin. Hi.
we are the Buckfast Abbey Bee Department, and we're recording this in our bee barn, um, and we're doing two talks for you, well, the same talk, but split into two half-hour sessions about pheromone communication. So this is what we're going to cover in the two talks. What is a pheromone? Why are they so important to honeybees? How pheromone communication regulates colony life, and how we as beekeepers can use pheromones or our knowledge of pheromones to help us manage our colonies.
So I guess, Claire, the first thing we need to clear up is what exactly is a pheromone?
Good question. Pheromones are widespread among insects, vertebrates, and are present in plants, fungi, slime molds, and algae. Even humans, although we do our best to mask them, use pheromone communications. And basically, it's tiny amounts of a very strong chemical compound which is secreted from our bodies, in our case, in tiny amounts, which would elicit a reaction from another, in our case, person or organism of the same species. So they're best known as sex attractants, basically. That's how we understand, or our knowledge of pheromones is basically as a sex attractant. But in actual fact, it's much more complex and far-reaching than that. So we've got two glandular systems in our bodies. They're either exocrine, which means that the glands open onto the skin and chemicals come out actually onto the skin, or there's the endocrine system, which are chemicals which communicate inside our bodies.
So that would be hormones.
Yeah, testosterone, estrogen, all those things which regulate the internal functioning of our bodies. But the exocrine glands in us would be, examples would be the sweat glands, salivary glands, mammary glands, tear glands, in the stomach pit, and the anal glands.
So all these glands, they look the same? They're just under the skin surface, I guess.
There's some examples of the types of glands. You know, they can range anything from simpler tubular glands to quite compact, complex tubular acinar glands.
Goodness.
And we pick these chemical signals up either through smell or through taste. And it's very apparent if you're a dog owner, if you own a dog and you go for a walk in the park and it meets another dog, the first thing they do is sniff each other's bottoms and even lick that area. And it's not that they're being rude particularly, it's just they're picking up pheromonal chemical signals about all kinds of things.
It seems to me, though, that as a human race, we've sort of rather we're fallen out of love with our pheromones.
Yeah,
we spend a lot of time sort of using underarm deodorant and things.
Yeah, we don't like the smell of sweat, or we profess that we don't like the smell of sweat. In actual fact, on the internet, now I only know this from the internet, I haven't been to one, there are such things as t-shirt parties. So people who, it's like a dating agency, people wear a t-shirt for 3 or 4 days without washing. Then all the t-shirts are put in plastic bags, and people go and sniff the plastic bags, and they pick one that they are not aroused by, but like the smell of best, and then that's their date for the evening. And it's reckoned that we are attracted to our partners by smell or pheromonal communication much more than, say, their personality or how they look. It's true.
I'll take your word for it.
Even plants communicate via pheromones. So I don't know, that's one of them. There's a beetle called the mountain pine beetle, which burrows into the bark of pine trees, and therefore eventually the tree will die. But the tree can produce a resin or to protect the wound, which also will trap the beetles and kill them. And the smells coming off from this resin will actually communicate with the tree next door to tell it to produce the resin, so to protect itself from these beetles. So it's possible that plants can communicate to each other to protect themselves. It's plant communication, plants between plants.
So honeybees then, pheromones vital to honeybees?
All insects have developed pheromone communication to quite a sophisticated level, but because honeybees live in huge numbers in quite small complicated spaces, so it's a very crowded space they live in, pheromone communication has become very, very important as a way of regulating the colony. And the trendy way of talking about this big family that the bees live in is a superorganism. It's a large number of animals of the same species which live together and which cooperate. So there are lots of individuals, but they operate as an organic whole.
So presumably then, Claire, you've got somebody in charge that's issuing orders. So the queen gives off pheromone and tells all the bees what to do, I guess.
Well, the queen has a great influence on the goings on of the superorganism, but in actual fact, she doesn't. That's not the way pheromone communication works. If we just go back to being a superorganism at the moment, it's a group of closely cooperating animals which behave as a unit. So they're all individuals, and the way that the way that conflict is avoided in this big family is that there's the worker bees particularly are differentiated into castes. So the queen does nothing but lay eggs. So that's her role, and the workers do all of the other jobs. And the other thing is there's cooperative care of the young. So the division of labour, there's a division of labour.
So the workers then have given up their right to reproduce just to look after the queen. So they only get their genetics into the next generation by helping the queen.
Yeah, by helping the queen. But the point is they all do make their own individual decisions, but somehow they're operating as a whole as well. And to answer your question of 2 slides ago, the queen doesn't issue orders in the way that, oh, you lot go over there and get me that nice pollen that I like, and you lot go over there and do a bit of tidying up. It doesn't work like that. It's more that her pheromones influence the behaviors that the bees have. So her pheromones would suppress some behaviors and stimulate other behaviors. So it's more about feedback systems and thresholds being gone above or dipped below. We'll expand on that a little bit more later. So bees do communicate via sound as well. Bees do make noises which are understood by other bees, but they don't have a voice book, so they don't talk through their mouth as such. Would you?
I think what they do basically is use their muscles in their thorax there, and they vibrate them, and usually press their thorax and their abdomen down onto the comb, and they use that, particularly empty comb, and they use that as a sounding board so that they can pass sort of vibrations as much as sound through the colony that way.
And even they will mount each other and actually press their thoraxes against another bee, as in the dorso-abdominal ventral dance.
Yeah, and they have sensors within them that pick up these sound vibrations. They see it as very pure sound, not like we would through our ears, but they pick it up through organs in their legs, their subgenual organs, and also on their antennae. And we'll talk more about antennae a bit later on because they're really important to bees.
And there is quite a range of sounds as well, isn't there? There's piping by the queen, and then there's the quacking in the queen cells, and then there's all kinds of low, and we all know as beekeepers, when you open a hive up and they haven't got a queen, there's like a low roar that we can hear.
That's right. And you know, we all know when we've had a hive open for too long because the pitch of the buzzing changes. You know when it's time to get out of there.
Yeah. They also use body language, or they would pick up information through watching each other move. But you have to remember, you know, there is the famous waggle dance. You have to remember this is all happening in the dark. And the bees that attend the dance, this is the scout bee, which is indicating to the bees where to go. The bees that are attending to the dance often get very close, and they're picking up vibrational signals as well. And also they're touching and picking up information through their antennae. So it's not just a visual thing, and very possibly there is smells going on there as well, because very often she's giving out free samples of food.
But really, we've talked about sound and we've talked about dancing, but for bees, the bulk of their communication is through pheromone.
I think for any eusocial or any superorganism, they say that 90% of signals used are pheromonal or chemical. And they can be used in combination with the other ones, but it's the main way that the bees communicate, and or any termites, ants, any of those big colonies.
Okay, so where's the bee's nose then? Because we know that they haven't got noses as such like we do. So
no, they don't have noses. They don't have ears either, do they?
No.
Their main sensory organs are, of course, their antennae. And these are terrifically mobile things. If you watch bees in the hive, they've got this beautiful, if I can just get my pointer, they've got this beautiful ball and socket joint here, and these antennae can swing around and be pointed in any direction. And then you've got all these different segments. I can't remember how many there are. Do you remember how many there are?
About 12, I think. But the drone has one extra one, and I can never remember.
And if we looked at these segments close up, you would see that they're covered in sensory organs. Just before we go on to that, we're going to look at the bee's eye, because bees is not just the antennae on the bees. There are sensory organs or sensory receivers all over the bee's body, even the eyes. This is a close-up of the bee's eyes, and you can see in between each of the compound lenses of the eye, you've got hairs which measure, when the bee's flying, it measures the wind direction, so she can gauge how far she's gone and how fast she's going. So the bees are covered in sensory receptors, but the antennae are really, really specialized. So this is a close-up of one of the sections. You can see it's covered in little pits, little pegs, little hairs of various lengths, and all these separate sensors are picking up information from different things. So these pits here, the sensilla placodia, are for smell.
Yeah, they pick up individual molecules will go down through a porous membrane there onto the receptors below. And as you say, they're sensilla placodia, and the little pegs there, they're sensilla, they're sensilla basiconica, and they are associated with taste. So if you think about it, with a human being, if we want to touch something, we tend to use our fingers. If we want to smell something, we use our nose. If we want to taste something, we use our tongue. But bees do it all with the antenna. It's a wonderful sensory organ for them.
And these pits, the sensilla placodia, they're very similar to what we have on the inside of our noses to smell with. And worker bees have 2,700 on each antennae. The queen bee only has 1,600, but the drones, and Martin will explain why this is so important later, have 15,000 on each antennae, so 30,000 in all, because they really need to be sniffing out virgins, but Martin will expand on this later. So apart from their antennae, they also have sensory receptors inside on their mouth parts, on their mandibles, because they would touch with those. They also have them inside the mouth, so a sort of taste area, but amazingly on their legs and on their feet. So as they're walking around the colony on the comb or touching bees, they can smell and taste with their feet.
So when you pull out a comb from a hive, you're looking at it and you've got these bees wandering around on it, or sometimes just motionless. Are they picking up senses all the time then? Is that what it is?
Well, the motionless ones are probably just resting, but the ones that are wandering around, it's called patrolling. they don't seem to be doing any job in particular. You know, when you look at a comb, you'll see bees that are tending the young, and you'll see bees cleaning out cells or looking after the queen. But these ones that seem to be just aimlessly wandering around are actually picking up pheromone chemical signals about what to do. So if a bee one is patrolling and she wanders over a larvae and that larvae is ready to be fed, needs feeding, it will give out a pheromonal signal which will tell that bee what kind of food it needed, and it needed feeding. And if the bee was a nurse bee and she had the hypopharyngeal glands all developed, that's what she would do. So they're continually just wandering around or patrolling and picking up information. And if a job needs doing and it's ready and it's got the wherewithal to do it, it will do that little job. But they don't work for very long. It's not one bee cleans out one cell. A bee might clean out a little tiny bit of a cell and then go and have a rest and have something to eat. And another bee will come along and do a tiny bit more of that cell. And it might mean 30 bees actually clean out a cell. So,
well, we always think, you know, that the analogy is busy as a bee. So you're telling me that they do more sleeping and resting and that sort of thing.
They don't need to, because there's so many bees. There's so many bees. They only need to be doing little bits and bobs of things, and everything will get done because they're communicating all the time. That, you know, they're only doing a job that needs doing because of this pheromone messaging. In fact, in 1952, there's a guy called Lindauer who did a lot of bee research, and he observed one worker bee in an observation hive for 177 hours. And he just watched that one bee. I guess he had a bit of help. I don't know how he could stay awake for that. But anyway, of those 177 hours, 56 hours, she was simply patrolling the nest. This doesn't mean that she was doing nothing. She actually spent, according to Lindauer, 69 hours and 53 minutes resting, or loafing around, as he put it. So it's not a bad life being a bee. You do get lots of rest and you do get lots of snacks.
Mm-hmm.
So returning to pheromones now. Martin's going to talk you through this one.
Okay, so on the screen there you can see we've got pheromones that act in two different ways, releaser and primer. If we look at releaser first, what a releaser pheromone does is it causes a very sudden and quick change in the behavior of the bees around it. So a really good example of that would be sting pheromone, which is isopentyl acetate. And we know that when a bee stings, it releases some of this isopentyl acetate, and that encourages other bees to come and sting at the same site, which is why if you get stung perhaps once, it may mean you're going to get stung 2 or 3 times in the same site. So that's a releaser effect of a pheromone. On primer, that's a much more long-term thing. And as we'll see a bit later on, the queen exudes pheromones from all over her body, and they combine to produce what we like to call queen substance. And that queen substance has the effect of preventing the ovaries of the workers from developing. So that is a much longer term behavioral change. The interesting thing is that we will also see that queens give off a pheromone from her mandibles, which we refer to as queen mandibular pheromone, and that can act as a releaser or a primer depending on the type and age of bee that are picking up that pheromone. So it's not just the pheromone itself, it's the bees that are responding to it that make the difference as well.
So we're going to look at the queen bee in more detail. She is, as we said before, she isn't Scott Morrison. She doesn't issue orders, or she doesn't have a sort of parliament where they agree on what's going to happen with the colony. But she is very influential. So she isn't a ruling monarch, but she's more than just an egg-laying machine. And we're going to look at the research that's been done on queen pheromone, because probably it's been done on queen pheromone more than any other chemical. So queen mandibular pheromone, the pheromones, or the cocktail of pheromones that she releases from her mandibular glands up here in her mouth, were first discovered or isolated by a guy called Colin Butler. in the 1950s, around that time, I think. And he kind of, I'm not a chemist at all, so these mean nothing to me. I think Martin can expand on them a little bit.
Okay, you've got the two key chemicals that he isolated and discovered were 9-oxo-2-decanoic acid and the 9-hydroxy-decanoic acid. The names have changed over the years, but if we abbreviate them to 9-ODA and 9-HDA, we won't go too far wrong. And he basically was the first guy to understand that these chemicals played an important role in how the queen manages to control the colony. He also found out one very important thing about them, and that is that they are have low volatility. And if you think about most scents, perfumes and things like that, you imagine them wafting around in the air. But these substances are very oily, that they are low volatile. And from that point of view, that means that they have to be moved through the colony by the bees, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. But that was one of the key things that he found out, this low volatility, and we'll come back to that several times. It's very important.
But she doesn't just produce, since then we found out she doesn't just produce pheromones from her mandibular glands. There are glands all over her body. So we've got the salivary glands, there's glands in her head, there's glands in her feet, her thorax, and there's a whole load of them down in her bum area or in this bottom end. So it's a much more complex language than we first realised.
And the interesting thing there is that the queen, as we've said, is now a specialised creature, but her hereditary roots were that she would have come from solitary or semi-social roots. Those bees, those queens would have had to have been a bit more of a jack of all trades, but the queen...
Jill of all trades.
Jill of all trades, yeah. So we need to remember that her glands in her head don't have to feed larvae, for example, so they can be more specialised to produce these pheromones that help control the colony. And looking at the rear end there, her Koshevnikov's gland, her Dufour's gland, she has a separate ovipositor and sting, whereas in solitary and semi-social bees, those sting chambers and ovipositors are combined, but therefore she's allowed to have a much more specialization of glands and secretions. And that's really important to how she helps to hook the colony together.
And the other thing is, very often these glands aren't working independently. Very often they're working synergistically. So you can imagine if a gland's being produced in this area, it's probably going to mix up with, I think the Koshevnikov and Dufour's gland probably work synergistically together to be an attractant to young bees. So very often glands are working, glands from here and glands from here would be working together to get quite complex behavioural patterns from the bees. So the summary really is she's producing this synergistic multi-glandular pheromones, and really it influences most of the behaviour within the colony. She's not conscious of that though. It's not a conscious thing. She's just oozing these out anyway. And then the colony and the bees are picking them again unconsciously. It's not. We always try and translate bee behavior anthropomorphically, like the bees want to do this and the bees want to do that and the queen wants. It doesn't work like that in the animal world, and certainly not with honeybees.
So I guess what we need to look at, Claire, is we know this queen is giving out all this pheromone, but it's got to be transferred around the colony, and as we said, it's low volatile. It's not going to waft through the colony on its own.
So one of the primary things the queen needs to do to get these pheromones out into the colony is she has to get bees to carry them or message them about. And the first thing she needs to do is get bees around her. And the bees that she attracts around her are young bees. Young bees are particularly under 6 days old are attracted to the queen. And this is the glands down in this area, the Koshevnikov and the Dufour's gland, attract these young bees in because she can't do anything for herself. She's lost the ability to feed herself. She does groom herself a little bit in that she's spreading these oily pheromones around her body, but she needs to be fed and she needs to be looked after and cosseted. Even they remove her feces. So the first thing is attract the young bees in, and once they're in there feeding her, and you'll find that if you've ever seen this in an observation hive, they'll touch her with their antennae and they're actually picking up the oily substance which is secreted from the glands, and it will be on their antennae, and then that bee will pass it on to another bee via antennal contact, and that bee will pass it to another bee, and so it will get disseminated throughout the whole colony. But it's really important that these bees around her are young bees, because they're not going to do her any harm.
Yeah, we've often thought that bees pass pheromone around the colony by trophallaxis, which you can see on the screen there, the food sharing. But that really takes too long. And these retinue bees, that they have to move this pheromone around very quickly. The pheromone will last on their antennae for about 30 minutes. And they need to get this disseminated out to the four corners of the hive. And so antennal contact seems to be much more important, so that they're picking up the chemical, this oily chemical from the queen, and then they're rubbing antennae with other bees as they go through the colony, about 30 minutes, and spread it around. But the key thing there is that the queen is pumping out this pheromone all the time, every minute of the day.
I was going to say that. Yeah, it's coming out of her all the time, so she's producing it all the time. So this signal that the queen is there and she's fit for purpose is constantly being spread around the colony.
Yeah. And they say that if you take the queen out, then the bees will know within half an hour.
They'll start being nervous and a bit agitated, and maybe even start converting larvae to be a new queen.
The other thing you notice is if you take a queen out during an inspection, you pop her in a cage, and you put the cage on top of it.
So we've learned quite a lot about the chemicals that are issued by each gland, and you'd think they would be able to say, well, this chemical makes this behaviour happen, but it's not as simple as that. If we just look at the list of chemicals which they've isolated from Dufour's gland, and actually they're still not really sure what Dufour's gland does, do they? They used to think it was it released onto an egg so that workers knew if it was queen-laid egg or a worker-laid egg, but that's kind of like gone by the by now. Look at all these chemicals here. And these are morphing and changing. They're organic chemicals. They're morphing and changing all of the time. So to isolate specific behaviors to specific chemicals is too simplistic.
Yeah, and this is why people sometimes say, well, why can't we use some synthetic pheromone to boost things in the hive or to alter things? Because we're a very blunt instrument in what is actually a very fine-tuned machine. And
we're going to just quickly, where's time clicking away here, we're just going to quickly whiz through some of the effects of queen substance, and I'm using the term queen substance because I'm referring to the whole cocktail of chemicals that the queen's giving off, not just queen mandibular pheromone, not just 9-ODA or 9-HDA. So the queen substance can inhibit queen rearing. That is, she stops them making another queen. So all of the time, there is an instinct, an innate desire in the hive, for, like a default activity, if you like, to be rearing a new queen. If the queen did accidentally get killed, this would kick in and it would save the colony. But her queen substance suppresses that instinct. So as long as the queen is there and she's giving out sufficient amount of pheromones, they won't raise a new queen. It's a kind of default thing. So if the queen pheromone dips below a level, the bees may supersede, or if the queen was taken out altogether, or we killed her accidentally, they would rear a new queen, probably from a 2-day-old larvae. And that's really important in beekeeping, and we'll expand on that later. Also, the queen substance, in conjunction with brood pheromone, suppress the ovaries from workers from developing. She also suppresses drone production up to a point. Now that sounds a bit weird, but when a colony first establishes in spring, they don't need drones, they need worker bees. So if she's had a brood break in the winter, the first thing she does is make worker bees. And then when there's enough worker bees, that's the point where she makes drones. So her pheromones will stop the worker bees making drone cells for her to lay in, because they're the ones that make the cells for her to lay in. And then when they're all getting a little bit less queen pheromone, because there's more of them and it's getting spread, they're all getting a little tiny bit less of the cake, if you like. That's the point when they start making drone brood for her, or drone cells for her to lay in. And similarly, it's at the same point that they start making queen cups, usually. And also, to a certain extent, she can stop the nurse bees from going on and becoming foragers for about 6 days. So she can keep bees young around her to look after her for about 6 days. Thereafter, the pheromone doesn't work on them anymore. I'm going to let you take the next section, Martin.
Okay, so apart from those inhibitory effects, it also has stimulatory effects. So we've talked about the attraction of the young nurse bees towards her for the retinue that forms around her. But it also plays a very important role in sex attraction in the mating process, and we're going to talk more about that in the second part. It also has the effect of increasing and encouraging brood rearing and preparation for cells. And what we mean by that is that when we look in a colony and we're expecting a new queen to develop, then we quite often say, oh, the cells have been prepared, and sometimes we say they've been shined up. They usually have an appearance where they've been laced with pheromone, which will encourage the queen to go and lay in there, and those cells we say have been well prepared. The other thing that it does is encourages the bees to forage and to go and collect more food. We often say, certainly in this country, that if you see pollen going into a colony, it's a sign that everything's queen right and okay. I'm not sure that that's entirely true, and I've seen pollen going into colonies that aren't actually doing that well.
Bees have a range of behaviours which they're hardwired to do. It's just that the queen stimulates them to do much more gusto and enthusiasm. So pollen will go into a queenless colony because that's what they do. They collect pollen. But if you've got larvae to feed, the queen will to be much more efficient about that and do it with much more zeal and purpose.
Yeah, one thing definitely a well-mated queen does encourage is comb building. And if you've got a queenless colony or a colony that's waiting for a virgin queen to get mated and take over the colony, they won't draw comb. You can give them frames, but they won't draw.
Wax columns, really, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. So that's certainly one to watch out for.